Hi, thank you for such a great introduction. I think the core ideas are already conveyed, so I don't really have to give my lecture anymore. But since I came, I will do it anyway. And thank you everyone for coming. It's such a great pleasure that there are so many people are interested in Marxism. And I hope that the University of Cairn will hire a couple of Marxist professors, because I think it's a problem in Germany that always the young students are interested in Marxism, Hegel, and critical theory, but it's always hard to find professors. That's a problem I had in Berlin. So it's just a kind of beginning. But it's also very sad to be in this kind of situation that many people are so worried about the future, and we have to talk about some kind of eco-socialism or even degrowth kind of society, because everyone wishes that everyone could be simply happy in capitalism, but it doesn't really allow this kind of ideology anymore. So there's some kind of disruption, and then I came with this book on degrowth communism, but even left-wing people criticize degrowth is bad, and you are reading of Marx is wrong, and so on. So I try today, after getting various kinds of criticism, try to explain why this idea of degrowth communism is not only valid reading of Marx, so this is more like academic part, and also why it is important to think in that way today. Not because Marx said it, so and so, but because it has some relevant contents, and this is more, I hope, the actual part that is useful for thinking about today's situation and the future. So my title is Marx Against Marx, Eco-Modernism versus Degrowth, so it's a little bit different from the poster. But there are different readings of Marx, and I'm trying to emphasize the shift in Marx's own thinking, and I try to reconstruct that kind of development, and especially focus on the late Marx, because he had some interesting ideas which we can learn a great deal today, but he didn't really elaborate on this point, so we didn't know about this until very recently, based on this publication of Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, which I am part of it. So let's begin. Usually I begin with some kind of this kind of data, how capitalism is bad and so on, but today I don't have time, so I just skip, and inequality is expanding, and then humans are stupid, and then carbon emission, and then the 1.5 degrees Celsius, but these are, I'm not a natural scientist, so just let you all know familiar, you guys are German. In Japan, people are not really, familiar with this kind of thing, but the planetary boundaries, and so. Anyway, so after seeing these slides, you know that we are in a very critical condition. And the problem is that COVID-19 is not the last crisis. No? We forget about this, but now the war and the inflation, and the climate crisis is obviously getting worse and worse. That means that we will have more natural disasters, also like food scarcity, water insecurity, accelerating inflation, also enlarging economic inequality. And over the next decades, there will be more climate refugees, and then there will be more, people like AfD, and there's like right-wing populism, xenophobia, and there will be also various kinds of conflicts. And I think it's totally right that Andreas Mann warns that we are in the situation of the chronic emergency, because the Anthropocene irreversibly transformed the planetary conditions. So if we just don't do anything now, what's waiting for us is a collapse of civilization. So this is a basic negation of our Western values, such as democracy, human rights, freedom, peace, and so on. So this is something that we want to avoid. Actually, I'm doing some research in Hamburg now, and my conclusion is that we cannot really avoid, but today we just, that's next book, so I stick to this point that we have to do something. And of course, it's not just me who is talking about this kind of idea, that many people are problematizing today's capitalism. So people talk about more redistribution is necessary, higher tax, and we can also tax carbon, and a big government is necessary, neoliberal, small government doesn't work, and so why don't we have some kind of mission economy, Max Cato, or stakeholder capitalism, ethical capitalism, Marx Gabriel, and there are also things like Green New Deal and so on and so on. But they are more like liberal democratic people whose solutions are based on this kind of reforms. No? And they believe that once these reforms are implemented, it's possible to achieve some kind of more efficient, more just, more innovative, and more sustainable, and more growth. So this is a very optimistic scenario that we actually cannot believe. I think it's very, if we just simply tax and then if the problem is solved, it's not really crisis. Crisis means that something that must fundamentally change because it's a real crisis. So it's understandable that especially the younger generations, like you guys, are more interested in radical changes, including socialist or eco-socialist and degrowth ideas. And so I'm also part of this kind of Fridays for Future in Japan, which is small and then now becoming even smaller and so on. But anyway, revival of socialism is here. So people even like Naomi Klein, who is definitely not a Marxist, is now talking about eco-socialism. But also Thomas Piketty, he talks about also his recent book that was published from Lusuyu. It's also the time for eco-socialism or something like that. So now even those people are talking about socialism, not about tax the rich people and so on. It's socialism. And so the left-wing people, Marxists, Andreas Malm and Zizek, are talking more communism. Then I also talk about degrowth communism. But today, so I try to explain what this is. And based on this idea that Marx is a degrowth communist, so why we need socialism or communism today, and why even we need a degrowth communism? Because I think it's increasingly clear that capitalism is a failed system, especially in terms of climate change. We cannot simply imagine that investment in renewable energies and some kind of green technology is enough to solve this problem. I think as long as infinite growth is the primary motive of this economic system, it is simply impossible to make this kind of the fast transition, fast decarbonization. And also the other problem is the rich people are, these like super rich people are really responsible for this destruction of our planet, like private jets or big houses and big cars. And so I think there is something that we really need to challenge, this kind of idea of free market, free competition, and economic growth as the most efficient system, and this kind of idea of private property and so on and so on. So it's really necessary to introduce some kind of ideas such as planning, kind of common property, socialization, Vergesellschaftung, and that kind of things are more of importance today. But the problem is, the old idea of socialism is also not sufficient, because once somehow the proletariat or the working class takes over the power and they start to redistribute the wealth and produce together, they democratically decide to produce more SUVs, or they try to build new pipelines, and it's totally possible that today's working class with today's consumptionist value will simply maximize its production for the sake of realizing some ideas of private jets for everyone. Of course, this is a caricature, some kind of extreme idea, but what I wanted to say is that equal society is not automatically more sustainable. Eco-society, based on today's capitalist ideas and based on unequal exchange, could rather even destroy our planet, and they could even reinforce some kind of imperial domination over the global south and so on. So I think it's understandable that not a small portion of the left-wing people who are deeply concerned about the environment and equality are now arguing for degrowth alternative with decolonization, gender equality, and so on and so on. But the problem is there's still a huge divide between socialism on the one hand and degrowth people on the other hand. I present some very typical statement from my friend and enemy Matt Huber. I mean, if you're familiar with Jacobin, he is often a contributor in criticizing my view. He, for example, says, overall, it would be quite sad to build socialist movement capable of seizing the means of production, only to prohibit from the outset the further development of the productive forces. Socialism is not stasis. What about nuclear fusion power, curing cancer? We still have so much left to accomplish as a species that capitalism might be holding us back from. So he's basically criticizing degrowth because degrowth is austerity, degrowth prevents further development of technology, while socialism should be focusing on the kind of emancipation of our productive capacity as human beings. So why don't we build more nuclear power plants and more sustainable electric vehicles and so on and so on. Well, this is a very typical, what I call eco-modernist socialist productivism. There's another critique from Trotsky's side. Michel Levy also is critical, was critical of degrowth, and he says many degrowth theoreticians seem to believe that the only alternative productivism is to stop growth altogether or to replace growth by negative growth, i.e. to drastically reduce the excessive high level of consumption of the population by cutting by half the expenditure of energy, by renouncing individual houses, central heating, washing machines, etc. Since these are similar measures of draconian austerity risk being quite unpopular, some of them play with the idea of the sort of ecological dictatorship. So degrowth is obviously unpopular because people want to, have more. So when we want to introduce degrowth, it must be some kind of dictatorship. This is ecological dictatorship, which is a common criticism against environmentalism too. So nothing new, but this is a common idea among socialists. So, I understand that then the degrowth side also kind of replies very negatively to Marxists or socialists. Serge Latouche is a kind of French first generation of degrowth people. He says, for example, the critique of capitalism was put forward by Marx. And yet, a critique of capitalism is not enough. We also need a critique of any growth society, whatever socialism or communism. And that is precisely what Marx didn't do. Because it cannot integrate ecological constraints, the Marxist critique of modernity remains terribly ambiguous. The capitalist economy is criticized and denounced, but the growth of the forces it unleashes is described as productive, even though they are destructive too. So Marx imagined some kind of future socialist society with more growth, so like other liberal democratic people. And Latouche is basically criticizing, no, this will be bad for the environment anyway, so socialism must be rejected. So this divide of socialists on the one hand and degrowth people on the other hand. And it's very unfortunate, I found, because ecological crisis is really a kind of manifestation of contradiction of capitalism And both sides are critical of capitalism, but they are kind of fighting each other. Then the capitalism just remains non-damaged, right? So it's necessary to kind of overcome this divide. And Frederick Jameson, who recently passed away, he was talking about this kind of division, and he says that one of the most durable opposition in utopian projection was that between country and city, countryside and city. So he's saying that this kind of anti-technology people and the more productivist people is not just among Marxists and degrowth people. It's kind of common in traditional utopian thinking. Like people like William Morris is kind of anti-technology, and Kropotkin, and there are also some more technocratic, productivist people. And, so there's always this kind of deep ecology. And he says, perhaps its more contemporary form, so today, involves a relationship to technology and correspondingly diminishing nostalgia for nature. So this is the city people. They don't really care about nature. This is just technology is more important. And on the other hand, this is countryside people, the passionate ecological commitment to the prehistory of the earth and ever feebler pride in the Promethean triumph of over non-humans. So there are some people who kind of go back to nature and more start some kind of their own communes and so on. So this kind of divide always takes place. And the crucial point for Jameson here is that utopias are not about mapping out positive blueprint or creating a perfect political schema. So it's fine, just let various kinds of utopia flourish, and it's fine. It's not like a task of theory, the Marxists to say, this one is better, so that's one is. So this kind of debate just doesn't really make sense. And Perry Anderson says, okay, for all their potential luxurious detail, so basically he agrees with Jameson, utopia retain stubborn negativity, an emblem of what, despite everything, we cannot grasp or imagine. So it's fine. It's something, utopia is something that we cannot really imagine in a concrete, positive way. It's just kind of, I don't know, simply we cannot say. It's always in negative way. No? But I would say that this is a very typical Bilderfair board. It's a very typical attitude that we can also find in Marx himself. That we shouldn't describe the future recipe for the future society, because this is something that working class people make themselves. It's not something that theory prescribes and so on. Eh? But I would also think that now, because it's in such a deep crisis, a more positive, concrete vision is necessary. Then otherwise, right-wing populism create some kind of more positive vision anyway, and they will be more attracted, right? So that was my attempt to provide some kind of positive utopian vision. As Raymond Williams says, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. So I try to give some hope rather than despair. And when I try to do this kind of thing, I was reading Marx, going back to Marx, and I tried to rediscover Marx's idea of post-capitalist society. The problem that I first encountered is obviously that he is very productivist and also Eurocentric idea that the humans, under capitalism, there are many problems, but also capitalism develops productive forces, and then we can use this technology and the productive forces for workers' emancipation too in the future. And he kind of celebrates, especially in this kind of famous passage in Communist Manifesto, when he was still young, he celebrates some subjugation of nature and clearing whole continent for the sake of cultivation, and so there's this kind of human power that really dominates and transforms the planet as the basis for the future emancipation. So that is one of those passages that ecologists often criticizes as some kind of proof that Marx was productivist, who didn't care about the environment and sustainability. However, there's another Marx, and especially in the 21st century, in the English-speaking countries, there are people like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett. They try to rediscover more ecological Marx. Rediscover meaning that also in the 60s and 70s, there are some people who talked about the tension between capitalism and the environment. For example, in Japan, there are a lot of discussion. In Japan, ecological economics was actually pioneered by a Marxist economist in the 60s. Because at that time in Japan, there are a lot of like pollutions, and then that was also regarded as clear manifestation of capitalist modernization. So it's not a very strange thing actually for Marxism to think about environment and the contradiction of capitalism together. But the problem is often it's a case that then, but in socialism we will have safer nuclear power plants, safer technology to produce iron and so on. So this is a very productivist at the same time. No? And in the 21st century, especially because of climate change, those people like Foster especially try to demonstrate that Marx was not only talking about this kind of ecological issues in some passages in Capital, Das Kapital, thousands of pages, and it's not that hard to find maybe one or two passages where Marx talks about ecology, but he tried to demonstrate that Marx is much more seriously interested in the issue of sustainability. And he also argued that ecological crisis is some kind of the central contradiction of capitalist mode of production, so Marx was actually kind of eco-socialist. And the famous theory that Foster and his colleagues developed is today called the metabolic rift theory. And the point is very simple. I wrote many things, but the point is basically that humans always have metabolic interaction with nature mediated by labor. But in capitalism, this metabolic interaction is mediated by value or price and commodity. And then capitalism aims to reorganize the entire metabolic interaction between human and nature for the sake of maximization of surplus value, the profit. And what happens is the metabolism of society, the circulation and production and the flow of commodity and money and capital, they expand with the economic growth or capital accumulation. And they also accelerate faster. They invest and they try to get money back as soon as possible with profit and so on. And so this doesn't stop. Continuous expansion and continuous acceleration of social metabolism on the one hand, but the metabolism of nature that human cannot so easily modify. We cannot create fossil fuel artificially. We have to wait millions of years until the formation. But the problem is human extract the fossil fuel in hundreds of years, in just a couple of hundred years. And then we just make lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But of course, the Earth cannot absorb all the carbon dioxide. So this is a natural process. This is what Marx called natural metabolism. The problem is social metabolism gets faster and bigger, but natural metabolism is more or less stable. Of course, we can intervene a little bit with technology, but it's limited. So Marx basically says there will be inevitably irreparable rift in this interdependent process between social metabolism and natural metabolism. And this will just spread all over the world because of the globalization. That was Marx's warning in the 19th century. And these are just like some passages that you find in Das Kapital. So still after the research done by Foster, some people said, oh, this is just, as I said, it's just some couple passages and they are over-exaggerating their importance. Marx was still very productivist and so on. And my first book, or it's also my German dissertation, Natur gegen Kapital, is a kind of a demonstration that it's not just some passages. Marx actually took so many notes before he wrote down those couple passages. So if you read his notebooks, or you don't have to even read, if you take a look at them, you realize like how many pages that Marx intensively took notes from books on agricultural chemistry, especially Justus von Liebig, but also about botany, geology, mineralogy, and one of the important books is Karl Flass, but they are like talking also issues, not simply like soil exhaustion, like agriculture, but also excessive deforestation, and that leads to the transformation of the local climate, and also premature slaughter of animals, and even extinction of species because of human intervention in bioecology. So it's very interesting that Marx didn't really integrate those ideas into his manuscripts of Das Kapital, but it's clear that he was interested in these issues as some kind of concrete manifestation of metabolic lift in various spheres. So it's very understandable. It's safe to say that Marx was eco-socialist. He was quite critical of capitalist destruction, what he uses the term raub or robbery due to this capitalist development of productive forces. And so that was my first book, and I was happy that I finished my PhD, and I got some like prize and so on. But the problem is, you know, when people read my book, they were like, hey, you said in the title Karl Marx's eco-socialism, and you don't talk about eco-socialism. Okay, because this is not a title that I gave, this is a title that Monthly Review Press actually decided to give. And the same problem actually happened with this German book, the Systemsturz. I just talked about this. But it's always the publisher tried to sell books by giving some more catchy titles, which creates some problem. But also had some productive impact on me, because then I felt like, oh, I have to then talk more about this concrete eco-socialist future. How does it look like? Why such a society more sustainable? How can they fix this metabolic lift? And why is it not leading to some kind of ecological austerity or ecological dictatorship? And these are the questions that I try to answer in this second book, Marx in the Anthropocene. So the starting question that I tried to answer was the following. So Marx in the 1860s, after leading Justus von Liebig especially, he came to recognize that the development of product forces in capitalism is actually just development of power of loud or robbery. So then here there's some tension in his general view of history, which we usually call historical materialism. Because historical materialism is like this. We have relations of production on the one hand, and this productive forces, or forces of production on the other hand. And the general idea is that there's a historical tendency that the productive forces develops with innovation, and we want to overcome different kind of scarcity and so on. So there is always the higher productive forces in the course of history. And the problem is, after a certain point, the existing relations of production, like slave system or feudal lord on here in the capitalist, they kind of try to stick to the old way of doing, and it really hinders the further development of productive forces. So then, after a certain point, this is an increasing tension between relations of production and productive forces, and the basic idea is once these productive forces reaches a certain point, there's an explosion, and then the mode of production, which encompasses both sides, will transform too. So from slavery economy to feudalism to capitalism, and then one day socialism and communism. So this is a very simple idea, but then easily it becomes like a maximization of productive forces is the precondition for any revolution. So that's why, understandably, many socialists in the 20th century kind of fell into this kind of productivist idea. But the problem is, if you accept this eco-socialist idea that development of productive forces in capitalism is actually increasing power of destruction, it's no longer really development of productive forces, right? So this is the problem. We don't have no longer this kind of linear progress of history based on the continuous development of technology and forces of production. And it also creates one more problem, because then with this linear idea of history, the Western people could say, hey, we are better than Asians or Africans because we have better technology. So Marx had this kind of idea too. Let's just invade India. And then we will bring, or like British people will bring some better technology, and then maybe we will have a revolution there too. So that's good. No? So this kind of simple idea doesn't also hold anymore, because then actually what Western society possess are more power of destruction or killing people, and that's actually today's situation. But so then it's no longer really clear which society is more superior or which society is on the higher stage of history and so on. So Marx was actually compelled in the 60s, especially late 60s, to reconsider his biased Eurocentrism as well as his productivism together. And that's why he had to kind of start from the scratch. He's in the identity crisis after publishing Volume 1. The middle-aged man who thought that Capital Volume 1 will be super successful bestseller, but it wasn't like that, and then even his idea of history is falling apart. So that was like a really deep, deep crisis, I think. And that's why, understandably, he started seriously starting again. And I think that's great. It's really, he started studying natural sciences, he even started learning Russian, and he started reading books on Russia, but also about Asian societies and even indigenous society in North America too. So there's a really like restart for the late Marx in the 70s especially. And so that's one thing. So two topics. One is natural sciences, but the other is non-Western pre-capitalist societies. And interestingly, in his very late stage of his life, he got a letter from Russian, and a Russian revolutionary, Vera Zasulich. And she was asking Marx that what kind of revolution is possible in Russia. Because Russia is not Western capitalism. Russia is, organized in a very different way. There are still many agricultural communes, and they have still some kind of collective ownership of land and also collective production. And of course, some productivist Marxists say, first eradicate those pre-capitalist, leftovers, and then modernize, then we will have socialism. But this sounds not convincing for Zasulich. So she decided to ask Marx directly what he thinks about the Russian situation. Should Russia follow the Western development? Isn't it a little bit kind of overgeneralization of theory? And is it basically like Eurocentric idea to say that? Nah? So it's, I think, very shocking for Marx, because this is exactly the problem that Marx also had. And that's why he was studying those societies very intensively. So he actually took this opportunity to formulate some of his final ideas. It's 1881, and he dies in 1883, so it's like a very last moment. And he wrote 3 manuscripts for this letter, but he didn't send it. He just sent a very brief letter in the end because of some political reasons and so on. But anyways, we can now read these letters and the manuscripts, and it's very interesting for several reasons. One is that he actually said that historical inevitability of the law of capitalist development that he discusses in Capital is expressly limited to the countries of Western Europe. So the Russia is exception. The Western society is rather exception. So it doesn't, Russia, Asia, other parts of the world, it's different. And he even says, if the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for proletarian revolution in the West, so that the two complement each other, then Russia's peasant communal land ownership may serve as the point of departure for communist development. So now Marx even recognizes that Russia can just begin its own revolution first. It's not Russian must follow. No, they have some their own agency to make history, and then followed by the Western proletariat art, and then they just work together. And so that's like a real good, different path to socialism is possible with their own initiative. So Kevin Anderson actually say, this is a very different, multilinear view of history, and this is even like a post-colonial Marx is the final Marx. And then some people criticized this. Like Stedman Jones, he thinks that this is all wrong. This is a very kind of a romantic, fetishized view of the non-Western society. So his interpretation is like, okay, Marx became very disappointed after the defeat of the Paris Commune, and then the Western European countries became kind of reactionary, conservative situation, so no hope of a revolution. And then the Russian people came, approached him, and like, we want to translate your book into Russian, and we have like many interesting movements actually going on, and why don't we collaborate? So Marx kind of had this excitement, and in the end he had this very wrong view of Russian revolution. So that's like old Marx losing his capacity to critically understand, and so just don't use Marx. That's Stedman Jones' conclusion. So this is a very actually anti-Marxist book, I find. And the more fundamental problem is both Kevin Anderson, who is more sympathetic, and Stedman Jones, who is more critical, are not paying enough attention to the entirety of Marx's theory, because they're only talking about non-Western pre-capitalist societies. But Marx was also studying natural sciences, so he was studying both at the same time. But the problem is they don't take, Kevin and Stedman Jones don't take these natural science notebooks into account. So I think they are related, but the problem is it's not connected well. And my hypothesis was basically they are connected based on the theory of metabolism or Stoffwechsel, because Marx was studying the conditions of sustainability, some kind of like what capitalism destroys and what happened to nature and the environment and so on, what kind of material conditions must be satisfied for eco-socialism and so on. But it was very hard for him to imagine a different way of organizing this Stoffwechsel, metabolism. So understandably, he had to look for other places, other histories, other ways of organization, other traditions, and they have other laws, about other customs, like different ways of collectively managing land, production, and so on. So it was for him both connected to imagine, in order to imagine a more sustainable production and how capitalism destroys that kind of metabolic interaction and transforms. And so from that perspective, using the theory of metabolism as some kind of background condition, it's possible to connect both his study on natural science and non-Western pre-capitalist societies. And interestingly, if you have this idea in your mind, and then go back to the letter to Zasulich, he actually said something like this. Today, capitalism faces a social system, which both in Western Europe and the United States is in conflict with science. with the popular masses and with the very productive forces that it generates in short in a crisis. So capitalism is in crisis because of working class movement, but also because of science and because of productive forces. What does he mean? Traditionally, people read this passage as very traditional way. It's a historical materialism, so it's a higher working class demanding better life, and then there's like productive forces, so more development, but this capitalism is hindering the further development, so this is a crisis, and then only this explosion of the contradiction could solve. This is a very Marxist-Leninist reading. However, considering Marx was already ecologically conscious in Capital, Volume 1, written in 1868, and he was criticizing this kind of productivist view because capitalist development of technology actually only destroys conditions for sustainable metabolic interaction. It's not really convincing to read these passages in such a productivist manner. So we have to find another way of reading this. And it's interesting how he says about Levy, for example, because capitalism was criticized by natural scientists at the time too. The main figure was Levy, and basically he's saying that the capitalism ignores the condition of rational agriculture, rationale Landwirtschaft, because it just tried to maximize the profitability in the short term. So when he uses the term like rational, it means basically sustainable, long year kind of. And he was criticizing, Levy was criticizing capitalist agriculture as robbery, Raub, and inspired by that, Marx was talking about more future society that governs metabolic interaction with nature in a rational way. So this is a scientific critique of capitalism, capitalism as irrational system. And this is something that today people like Rockstrom is talking about with planetary boundaries and so on. So it's something similar was happening at the time. So that's maybe the meaning that Marx means that the capitalism faces a conflict with science, like today, basically. Then how does this crisis end? He says, Marx says, the crisis of capitalism will end through its own elimination. So capitalism must be gone. Through the return of the modern society to a higher form of an archaic type of collective ownership and production. This is very interesting, actually. Marx doesn't think that capitalism's elimination takes place by maximizing productive forces. No, he says actually it's the opposite. The Western societies needs to return to pre-capitalist society for the sake of establishing communism. But what does it mean? It's not just going back to nature, because he also says it's a higher type, higher form. But this is very different from the traditional productivist view, because he's something expressing here the results of what he learned of non-Western pre-capitalist societies. So my conclusion is basically that Marx, after studying natural sciences and as well as non-Western pre-capitalist society, he came to recognize that non-Western society had a very different way of organizing Stoffwechsel with nature, and actually in a very sustainable way. People were not even equal, more equal, because of the collective means of land, and they had, very traditional way of living, so people are basically equal, but also it's more sustainable because the production was not for the sake of growth. It was mainly for the sake of satisfying needs, and also it was based on the tradition. Last year or tens of thousands of years we did this way, so we do this way this year again and again. So there was no really technological development, which Marx hated in the 50s. That's why he was supporting the idea of British imperialism, because it brings the kind of historical dynamism to Indian communes. More development, trains, ship, and new technology, machines. That really begins the historical development in India or in other places. But here, Marx just has opposite view. Good, actually, that kind of stasis is good because it means sustainability. It means equality. Otherwise, this society would have vanished thousands of years ago. That even today, or like even the end of 19th century, or like some indigenous communities here today in 21st century, that they still exist means that they have so much power too, so much power to survive, even in front of this gigantic power of capital. So this is something that Marx really changed his idea. And he celebrates now this idea of stationarity, as a kind of material foundation for sustainable and equal society. And Western society needs to return to this kind of archaic type. But of course, with today's technology, with Western capitalist technology, not everything, but things that we can still use. Yeah? So this is basically the moment Marx became degrowth communism, I believe. I think it's very different from just maximization of technology, productive forces, and then overcome all the limitation, and then we will have some kind of happy society. Rather, this is a really serious learning from non-Western societies, or today's expression, global South, and also self-critical attitude towards capitalist productivism and how it destroys the environment and so on. So this is a very different kind of idea. He tried to learn from the global South, and he tried to integrate what he learned to his new vision of the future. Then that really created not just simply different paths to socialism exist in Asia, in Africa, in Western Europe. No, the vision of post-capitalism itself, the idea, the content, or whatever you say, changes too. Because now it's not about maximization of production, it's not about technology, it's not about extraction of more wealth from nature, it's degrowth communism. So that's basically my conclusion, but people criticize it is then a new kind of austerity. So that's something I try to answer as well. My favorite passage is basically one from Critique of Gotha program, written in 1875. What's interesting is, I admit that Marx never said degrowth communism. It's just something that he was trying to develop his new ideas in his letter and in his notebooks, but he was not able to formulate his ideas in the clear way that I'm now describing, of course. But he was, of course, ambivalent. He was always kind of going back and forth, and that's interesting. But it means that once we recognize some possibility of reading Marx in a certain way, we can project back to the 70s and even 60s, because then you also find some passages that Marx was also hinting this kind of transformation. But these passages are often read in a productivist manner too. So this is a very representative, and this is a very famous passage about communism. So let me read this. He says, in a higher phase of communism, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and thereby also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. So no division of labor anymore, and no more bosses only ordering others to do things and so on. After labor has become not only a means of life, but also life's prime want. So alienation is gone, work is so much fun. After, I hope that it's gonna be happening. After the productive forces have also increased. And here he talks about the increase of productive forces, of course, with the all-round development of the individual and all the springs of commonwealth, genossenschaftliche Leistungen, flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribed on its banners from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. So what is interesting in this passage is the term, that Genossenschaftliche Recht. And he at the same time talks about kind of productive forces increase, and then it means that they can produce more and so on. So it seems kind of, some people say it's a very productivist vision of communism. Here he celebrates the more material production and more productive forces, and then we can use those technology to develop our capabilities and potentialities and so on. Matt Huber would say so. So this is, for some people, the negation of degrowth communism. But for me, this is a very interesting passage as well. Why? Because if this passage is about private jet for everyone, I would say that that kind of society is still trapped in the narrow horizon of bourgeois life. That everyone possesses big cars, big house, big whatever. And it's not really very different from capitalism. It's just like a better capitalism, that everyone becomes capitalist. What's important is this Genossenschaftliche Recht. And he was studying Marktgenossenschaften, and he is also studying a different kind of pre-capitalist communes and communities, and it's called often Genossenschaften. And this is kind of commonwealth has different kind of abundance, different kind of richness. And if you realize this is kind of like a richness of Genossenschaftliche Recht, then you go beyond the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. I think this is what he means. And this is something that capitalism hinders us from developing too. Capitalism allows us to produce many things for private consumption and a private kind of Genuss, the joy, but it doesn't allow us to collaboratively, like together, develop some kind of commonwealth for the sake of everyone. And that is something that today in English, like a public luxury or communal luxury, the öffentlicher Luxus or something like that. This is something that is really disappearing in this society of capitalism. Everything is commodified, everything becomes private ownership. Public transportation, education, medical system, all degrading in the way the commonwealth, nothing anymore. And so this is really the world that makes difference, is some kind of society based on Genossenschaft, the abundance of Genossenschaftliche Recht. And this is something very different from what we usually associate with Marx. Because, as I said, Marxism is often productivist, higher productive forces, but these are, I think, all trapped in the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. And this new reading of Genossenschaftliche Recht is, of course, compatible with degrowth idea, and it is also against austerity, because it focuses on the new idea of abundance, not material abundance, but also this kind of communal abundance, communal luxury, which is very important for today's ecological crisis, because we have the only limited resources, we have this time limit for decarbonization. That means that it's really necessary to think about a way of reducing our ecological or material footprint while also not leaving anyone behind. So I think this communal luxury is based on sharing, helping each other, and it's kind of guaranteeing everyone the basic access and so on, is some very important idea even for 21st century. And here's my kind of summary. The traditional Marxism or socialism was fetishizing growth, and they didn't care about green technology. And some recent eco-socialists,
like Matt Hoover, are advocating eco-modernism, defending not only growthism, but also pro-green technology. And they criticize degrowth is Stone Age communism. So they are like not only anti-growth, but also anti-technology. Just go back to nature kind of thing. But the thing that I try to defend is not Stone Age communism. We do need electric vehicles, we do need renewable energies, but it doesn't require this infinite capital accumulation anymore. And even in socialism, infinite growth is bad for the environment. So this is the idea of degrowth communism. The different way of organizing nature, different way of organizing technology, and so on. This is my final slide, and just trying to highlight the difference between eco-modernism and degrowth communism. The eco-modernism is a continuation of the Western imperial project. This is a very problematic view. We have this kind of technological efficiency, so we can just keep whatever we are doing because we have brought about better technologies and so on. But that is also accompanied by colonial, imperial kind of extraction of wealth and destruction of nature, land grabbing and some genocide and so on. So degrowth is actually the total opposite. It recognizes this kind of historical responsibility and thus advocates some kind of new project of decolonization. And second, eco-modernism is quite clearly tied to the issue of productivism, growthism, and extractivism. And on the other hand, degrowth offers a more eco-feminist subsistence perspective. So I didn't talk about ecofeminism, but I wanted to highlight that, it's not just Marx who, of course it's not. I'm rather learning from degrowth people or ecofeminism, and then it sounds very convincing. So then how should I do with this theory that I learned in the last 15 years? So what should I do with Marx? Is Marx just useless, or what should I do? And I think it's a very interesting way of integrating this idea of subsistence perspective. It's not about growth, it's about care, it's about mutual aid, it's also about connection with nature. That's what I mean with the spirituality here. And these are the things that I think the eco-socialist degrowth also needs to integrate. And this is not something like I think Marx can do very well, but I think it's possible to do. And the eco-feminist tradition of Maria Mies, Vandana Shiva, and so on are very helpful to imagine that kind of integration. And finally, the eco-modernist technology does not realize post-scarcity economy. And this point is very important because we are so used to believe that someday the new technology like nuclear fusion will realize abundance. AI, robot, and then we have full automation and we don't have to work. But I don't think that kind of future will take place. Even if the AI and the robots develops, we just still have to work, but also very boring work. And so it's even more dystopian. And in order to overcome this problem, I think it's important to recognize that scarcity is not a natural threshold. It's not a natural problem. It's rather created by social relationship. It's a scarcity that we today confront is often the social scarcity. It's not that our technology is too primitive, that we don't have enough food or we don't have enough water or electricity and so on. We do have enough. We have such a high capacity even to destroy this entire planet, going beyond planetary boundaries. The problem is, so not the natural side, but social side. And this is the system of monopoly, the system of just huge inequality and history. And that must change. And if we recognize this, and if we focus more on the public luxury, it becomes unnecessary to maximize technology. So that's why we don't need eco-modernist technologies anymore. It is totally possible to achieve, rather this is the only way to achieve post-scarcity economy based on public luxury and private sufficiency. Thank you so much.